There we go. Okay. So as Kyle said in the introduction, my name is Andrea Richardson. I am the Climate Adaptation Coordinator for Archaeology in Nova Scotia. So the first thing that people say is, yeah, that's a very long title. But the second question that I get from the public in general is, how does climate change and climate adaptation related to archaeology? So that's basically what we're going to talk about today and what the archaeology sector in Nova Scotia is doing about it. So archaeologists in general talk about climate change a lot. We talk about how climate has changed over the period of human existence. We talk about the big changes like the advance and retreat of the glaciers, huge impacts like volcanic eruptions and how that changed weather patterns and climate over the short to medium term. Even my master's thesis back in 2004 focused on a particular response by a particular group of people to a relatively rapid climate change. In that particular case, it was desertification and changing precipitation patterns in what in Europe is called the medieval warming phase, something like that. But it caused massive droughts throughout sub-Saharan Africa. So archaeologists talk about climate change in that sense, but archaeologists also talk about climate change in terms of the intensification of climate change effects due to human activity and how that impacts archaeological sites in particular. And archaeologists all over the world are talking about this in terms of whether that's coastal erosion in Scotland or sea level rise in Florida, wildfires in California and British Columbia, or droughts and desertification in sub-Saharan Africa, or permafrost melt and warming soils in the Arctic. Over the past decade or more, archaeologists have been responding to that threat and attempting to adapt to the rapid changes to our work. The Canadian Archaeological Association, the Society for American Archaeology, the Society for Historical Archaeology, and the European Archaeological Association, to name a few, have climate change committees in terms of dedicated to discussing the threats and working on adaptations to those threats. The Northwest Territories has a dedicated climate change archaeologist, Mike O'Rourke. And then there are programs through the University of Calgary, for example. They're digitally preserving Alberta's diverse cultural heritage, which includes threats from climate change as well as threats from vandalism or development, recording for the most part, standing structures, historical buildings, but also archaeological sites and other significant cultural locations. And here in Nova Scotia in 2017, there was the Coastal Project, which looked at impacts, the changes to archaeological sites in a small area between the time they were recorded and 2017. So this photo is from Fort St. Louis on the south shore of Nova Scotia. I'll be going back to that place quite a bit to talk about climate change. The photo on the left was taken on the Friday, and then the photo on the right was taken on the Monday. Over the weekend, post-tropical depression Lee. So there's observable impacts to an archaeological site. Archaeology is about storytelling, about using artifacts, features, sites, scientific data like isotopes, and their places in time and space and their context to tell stories about the past. In Nova Scotia, the ancestors of the Olnu or the Mi'kmaq have lived here for at least 13,000 years. And ever since then, people have lived here, made lives here, and left physical material evidence of their presence. And that's a lot of stories. But those stories are under threat because people of the past, like people today, tend to live along the coasts and take advantage of the coastal resources and live next to rivers. And these places are affected the most by the impacts of climate change. The threat of climate change to archaeology worldwide has been often referred to as with the metaphor of the burning library. If the library is burning, you need to know how many books you have, what kind they are, and which ones are closest to the fire. And that's our challenge in climate adaptation in Nova Scotia, is knowing where those resources, where those sites are. Archaeology in Nova Scotia is, for the most part, development-based, and therefore it doesn't cover everything. There also aren't very many archaeologists working in Nova Scotia, but to be able to find all of the sites and keep track of those changes over time. So coastal erosion is one of our biggest threats. Nova Scotia has 13,000 kilometers of coastline, and all of that coastline is vulnerable to things like sea level rise, coastal flooding, and the impacts of waves from intense storms. How vulnerable it is varies depending on the shape, depending on the coastal geology, depends on the rocks, the sediments, soils, and the vegetation, but all of it is vulnerable. And you can see coastal erosion happening in this photo. There are soils and sediments and vegetation coming down off of that cliff. So here are just a few more examples of some coastal erosion and its possible impacts on archaeology. Once again, another shot from somewhere on the Minas Basin with soils and sediments and vegetation eroding. The top right isn't necessarily archaeological. That's Lawrencetown Beach. And it's an example of where there is intense wave action. For those of you who are familiar with Lawrencetown, that's one of Nova Scotia's big surfing beaches. So the waves are actively eroding that headland. And then the bottom right is from Point Pleasant Park, and you can see the erosion along the left of the structure there. The impacts of coastal erosion were accelerated in Point Pleasant as a result of Hurricane Juan. There were massive changes to the park during that hurricane. So next we come to submergence. So this is also happening throughout Nova Scotia. It can be related to rising sea levels, just archaeological sites being permanently or seasonally inundated with water. So once again, we're back at Fort St. Louis on the South Shore. And in this photo, you can see how much water there is. But in the upper left, there were excavation units there in 2021 that would be very problematic to try and excavate in 2023 when this photo was taken. So that's a change over just a couple of years due to the changing environment around it. And while underwater archaeology is definitely a thing, archaeology in submerged locations, terrestrial archaeology in submerged locations is very, very problematic. So I'm cheating a bit on this one. This is from Alberta. As Kyle mentioned in my bio there, I spent a long time working in consulting in Alberta and working with the society there. So this is from the Bow River, which is just west of Calgary. And this area was severely affected by the major floods in June of 2013. So much so that the government of Alberta actually hired archaeologists to go out and check on sites and to see how much change there had been as a result of this event, and to identify any new sites that may have been exposed. So this particular area, which I'll show again in the next photo, is a terrace of the Bow River. Several meters width was lost as the between the early assessments of this site and 2017 when this photo was taken, partly as a result of that flood, partly because that flood softened and undercut the bank there. So you can see on the terrace that floods over time helped to build this archaeological site, build an archaeological site here. This isn't all an archaeological site, but it also tore it apart. And that damage in this area exists over 100 meters. So the changes from a single event like that, with the intensification and change in precipitation patterns, can be extreme. And here in Nova Scotia, I'm sure, I haven't been out to investigate, but I'm sure we had similar effects along, say, the Stewiacke and Shubenacadie rivers. And then in the bottom right is a picture of the Barrington Woolen Mill. Once again, that was post-tropical depression Lee. It caused flooding around the mill. And that's just sort of a reminder that this is affecting archaeological resources, but heritage resources in general. So here is another sort of cheating one. This photo was taken in the summer of 2018 in Slave Lake, Alberta. I actually had to enhance the photo somewhat to actually show any contrast between the sky and the trees there. Alberta and British Columbia have a lot more experience with the effects of large wildfires on archaeology than Nova Scotia does. One of the projects of that group that I was talking about, the Digitally Preserving Alberta's Diverse Cultural Heritage, was actually recording the visitor center at Waterton National Park in southern Alberta after a major wildfire there in 2017. And British Columbia actually has a process whereby archaeologists go out to look for archaeological sites after wildfires have gone through. So that is one of the, they talk about the damages and the opportunities of climate change. One of the opportunities of wildfires is the ability to identify archaeological sites through surface survey. In a lot of cases, the undergrowth, the lower vegetation will be burned off. Archaeological sites in forests tend to be quite shallow, So it is an opportunity to identify those sites that the artifacts often become exposed on the surface. But that same process that exposes sites on the surface also leaves them vulnerable to erosion later on. So then that becomes a problem, and we can lose sites that way. There can also be damage from fires to artifacts themselves, just from the heat and the exposure. But one of the biggest impacts to archaeological sites, archaeological resources, and the stories that we have the ability to tell is through wind events after the fires go through. So if any of you have driven down Highway 103 on the south shore of Nova Scotia, you will have noticed, as I noticed, even since December, there are major changes in the trees within the burn area. There are trees down all over the place. And that's a significant change, even from being there in December. So that is one of the ways that wildfires can cause major disruptions to archaeological sites. They lift those root balls with the sediments tied up in them, and then they turn the sites over so that we lose a lot of that context and that understanding of what was happening in that site previously. So my photo in the top right is at the edge of the 2011 Slave Lake fire, actually. And it was taken in 2017 or 2018. And what you can't see in this photo is that there are hundreds of trees down in this area. This area didn't actually burn, it was at the edge of one, but that there are hundreds of trees down. You can't see it because the rose bushes and the alder bushes have kind of grown up to waist or chest high, which makes that area really difficult for archaeological survey in many ways. So I previously already mentioned Hurricane Juan, post-tropical depression Lee. Nova Scotia is experiencing more and more of these events, and a single one of these events can cause major changes to archaeological sites. Again, this is not a new phenomenon. There is a reference in Matthew Betts and Gabriel Reinek's The Archaeology of the Northeast from David Black, from a talk that he gave, of letters between a naturalist in New Brunswick and the Smithsonian Institution discussing the changes to archaeological sites in New Brunswick after the Saxby Gale, which was a tropical cyclone that hit that region in 1869. So, yeah, major changes over the course of a single storm. So here, once again, is Fort St. Louis. Wesley Weatherby did a drone or UAV assessment view of the site, two of them. The top one was done on September 8th. The bottom was done September 22nd. And you can see those major changes to that site over the course of a few days. There's huge movements of cobbles in particular, cobbles and boulders in particular. A lot of those cobbles are larger than fist size, more like loaf of bread size. And as you can see from the measurements at the bottom there are places where those cobbles were overwashed over the berm there by almost 16 meters. which is a lot of movement and a lot of change. And that can affect how we interpret what happened at this site in the past, as well as what we are able to do at the site now. So there are places, once again, that were opened excavation units back in 2021 that are now buried under over 30 centimeters or 40 centimeters of large cobbles, just from that single storm. And then that black dotted line shows the shoreline before the storm. The red line shows the shoreline after the storm. In a lot of places, there was a meter lost of shoreline just from one storm. So you can imagine, as these storms intensify and become more frequent, that this is becoming an increasing problem. So that brings us to adaptation. Archaeologists have been noticing these direct impacts of climate change for a long time. And archaeologists have been trying to adapt to that climate change for a long time. There were experiments in New Brunswick in the 1970s and 1980s, building hard infrastructure with riprap, with armor stone, and with cement at archaeological sites. In that case, particularly, shell middens. But the site continues to erode behind those hard infrastructures. They're also really expensive to maintain and difficult to get to, or difficult to maintain. So in really rural areas without good road access, they're also extremely problematic that way. And then the biggest problem with these hard infrastructure projects, depending on the local coastline, is that they direct the wave energy away from the site. They don't dissipate the wave energy coming in from intense storms. They spread it out and redirect it. So you might be protecting one archaeological site only to damage 10 more. So more recent discussions going on in the archaeology sector, in coastal protection, have focused more on nature-based solutions using vegetation, also using things like artificial reef structures and things to try and break that wave energy. But some of the solution going forward is inevitably going to be salvage that, depending on the context or the type of site, that may be all we can do. So that brings us to, we're trying to adapt. We're trying to make changes to our practices to be able to accommodate these changes to the climate. And that's what adaptation is, that we're trying to future-proof our plans. And that brings me to the Climate Adaptation Leadership Program. So this was a program that was launched in 2019 by the provincial government. And it was a partnership between the Department of Communities, Culture, Tourism, and Heritage and Environment and Climate Change. And then archaeology was chosen as an external sector to partner with the department with CCTH, with the department, to develop its own adaptation strategy. So there were a number of other departments who are partnering with external sectors. Department of Agriculture with horticulture, Christmas trees, and cattle and sheep. The Department of Natural Resources and Renewables with electricity. The Department of Environment and Climate Change with fresh water. and coastal parks as well. So all of those external sectors now have implementation coordinators. So the first part of this program ran, as I said, from 2019, and then it ran until 2022. And during that time, a team of archaeologists called the SCAN team and other sector stakeholders created an adaptation strategy for archaeology. And that was finalized. The final draft of that adaptation strategy was finished in December of 2022. And then the next phase launched. So the biggest part of that the ability to launch that next phase of the strategy was having climate plan funding to move forward. Then Cape Sable Historical Society was confirmed as the host organization. I was hired again later in July, and I am based out of the Cape Sable Historical Society and the Barrington Museum Complex. But my position is meant to serve the whole province. So that's part of it. We're hoping to have activities and projects throughout the whole province. And that is sort of the purview of the implementation team, which was formed out of that SCAN team that I mentioned before. And that is a team of volunteers from the archaeology sector who are working on activities in that strategy. So, turning that strategy into action. First, I'm going to go through a brief description of the key points of the strategy, and then we'll see where we go from there. So, these are the four, intermediate outcomes of the strategy. So this is what we're working towards. Using climate information so that by 2027, information about climate risks to archaeological sites and resources is widely available and effectively communicated to the sector. This information is used in all stages of the archaeological process in Nova Scotia. Community stewardship so that by 2030, Nova Scotians are actively participating in the stewardship of archaeological resources, archaeological sites that are highly likely to be impacted by climate change. And coinciding with that and working with the community stewardship is collaborative governance so that by 2030, the Nova Scotia archaeology sector is effectively coordinating adaptation efforts through committed partnerships and collaboration. And then for our fourth one, protection, so that by 2030, important sites among the most vulnerable inventoried archaeological sites in the province are protected from climate change. So what does all this amount to? Number one, the timelines are ambitious. That is partly by design, so that we are continuing to move forward. But the big takeaway from the strategy and from moving forward is that this is about relationships between the archaeology sector and communities, so that we're developing citizen science type projects so that communities are able to make decisions for themselves in terms of which sites are important to them and which sites should be protected going forward. And when we refer to protection, that's sort of a broad term, actually. It can refer to things like nature-based solutions to protect coastlines, It can refer to things like salvage archaeology projects, or it can involve decisions called adaptive release, where archaeological sites are allowed to erode as they are eroding. And those are decisions that are meant to be made in partnership with communities. So that implementation team, that awesome group of volunteers that have been working so hard over the winter, have been working on a lot of activities, and I'm going to focus on a few, but they currently have 14 activities on the go, and we're adding some more as we go into our new fiscal year. But the key activities as part of this strategy implementation going forward are our community reporting form. So that is related to that citizen science project that we were talking about, where coastal landowners and community members who have interest in archaeology and who watch and walk coastlines regularly, who know their areas intimately, can report changes to archaeological sites. And as part of that, we're working on community stewardship workshops to help communities to report sites, to know what climate change looks like in sites, but also to help them make decisions going forward. And then climate change vulnerability model for known archaeological sites in Nova Scotia, so that the community knows more about, the sector knows more about which sites are the most threatened in the province and which areas to target for protection. Although, once again, in terms of hierarchy, community priorities will come first. Although the most vulnerable archaeological sites will be the focus, if you know what I mean. Okay, that didn't come out quite right, but anyway, so this is our science-based study looking at various factors of climate change with the data that we have available with known archaeological sites, so we can see which ones we should target to look at least as a sector. And then a fourth part of that strategy moving forward is raising awareness of the threat of climate change to archaeology and raising awareness of archaeology in general through outreach activities like this talk. We're also working on activities for the social studies program, contacting radio stations to try and move that forward, working on a lot of things to try and just raise awareness of the way that climate change impacts our archaeology. So we don't have our process developed yet, but anyone who has concerns about archaeological sites, archaeological resources, you're seeing artifacts eroding out of coastlines, absolutely report those through special places to the Department of Communities, Culture, Tourism, and Heritage. And this is just taken directly from their website in terms of how to report finds and sites, because the more that the sector knows, the more that archaeologists know which sites are being affected, the more we can take action. So, yeah, I hope I hope through the course of this talk, I have impressed upon you the impact of climate change on archaeological sites, and why we might find that important. Obviously, I work in heritage. I think that those stories, our collective history, our collective story as Nova Scotians is very important. And with climate change, we're losing those stories. Once an archaeological site is gone, it's gone. We lose any ability to tell those stories moving forward. So, yeah. So thank you for this opportunity to talk to you, and my contact information is there if you have questions. Sorry, I'm just freezing up here.
No, thanks very much, Andrea. I'll stop the recording, but we'll go through some comments here. Maybe I find leaving your
Yep.
presentation up sometimes helps.
Oh, no.
Well, so I
Okay.
find sometimes folks like to go to a certain slide.
Yeah.
But
There we go.
cancel the